I'm Peter Leyden, and I'm a longtime person here of the Valley and the Bay Area. I originally have been a journalist. I came to the Valley in the early 90s, at the very earliest kind of kickstart of the digital revolution, as really one of the first professional hires at Wired magazine, when we were trying to rough out to people, what is this digital revolution? What is this web? And what's really going to happen in that space. But I've stayed here since that time. Worked at a place called Global Business Network, which is a kind of a high-end group that was dealing with big governments and big companies to help them think more systematically about the future. And I worked in the think tank there. And then I also left after the 2004 American presidential election, and I spent about a 4-year stint in politics, in which I helped the Democrats and ultimately Obama shift to the new tools and new media of the digital media that's really transformed how you do politics today, including ending up as I was on the Technology and Media Advisory Committee for Obama in that campaign. And so after that campaign, I basically founded a company called Next Agenda, which is what I currently am running now as CEO. And what Next Agenda is trying to do is take advantage of those new generation of web tools, collaborative tools, and also the cheaper video to actually help organizations solve complex problems in which you need to both link the kind of collaboration that happens face-to-face in meetings and gatherings, which is nuanced and powerful, with essentially scaling up many more people getting involved online. So our two things is make the linkage from physical to virtual through the video, and also then scale up through next generation web tools. And that's what I'm doing right now. Let me step back and kind of give you my perspective on how California is really the future. I'd like to just take it the little lens of, without being too chauvinistic, I would say, for the sake of the project here, listen for two beads on. I mean, California has just so consistently roughed out the first draft of the future for the country, and often it kind of spins off into larger implications for the West, Europe, and ultimately sometimes the world, that it really bears focusing on and understanding that. It's happened in technologies, not just the internet technologies. It was really early in aviation. It was really early in, television actually was invented here. I mean, a lot of different things that are real core technologies were built here. We've seen it with social trends, the building of the suburbias and the culture around freeways, and you see it with cultural things around surfing and the whole thing, and musics and things that have come out of there. And so in general, people kind of get the general thing that it's kind of a trendsetter, but it's like, I would be even further that there's essentially that the future gets roughed out in rough form here and often gets leveraged. And this actually takes the form of not just technologies, social trends, and cultural ideas, but it actually happens in politics as well. And so that is one piece that I think people underappreciate. And I think it's also extremely important to understand what's happening right now in California. And I think it might have potentially some implications long run, at least in the bigger scenario way of what's happening with your project. So the quick way, if you want me to give you my quick California's the future through the political lens, is basically the politics that's been played out in this country for the last 30 years. And I won't quite make the implications of how it plays out in Europe, but there's an echo and kind of how it works in Europe too. But the politics that played out here for the last 30 years is basically was invented in California. It was basically it was Ronald Reagan is governor, and then there was a kind of 70s tax revolt that was kind of the beginning of conservative, really modern conservative politics in the United States that was born out here and eventually got exported nationwide when Reagan became president, and the tax revolt kind of went through the whole United States. And essentially that same debate over free market cut kind of regulations, cut taxes, battle against big government was essentially what the current Republican crop is battling with in Washington to this day. It's the same rhetoric, it's the same techniques, it's the same theories, it's the same framework that essentially was invented about 30 years ago. What's curious about it is that whole thing is completely dead, defunct, long gone here in California. And so while the rest of the country was watching that same kind of titanic struggle continue yet again in this last midterm elections, in California, in fact, Republicans could not win even one statewide race from the governor and all the kind of senior kind of folks that kind of run the state. It was all dominated by the Democrats. Both houses of the state are completely dominated by Democrats. Every single congressional district in which a Democrat was in, none of them got lost to Republicans, unlike in the rest of the country where 60 of these seats got taken back in this backlash against Obama. And so what you've got here is essentially a very, unlike any state in the union, frankly, right now, you essentially have a state that's completely and utterly dominated by Democrats, and not just Democrats, but what we would call in our context progressive Democrats. Democrats who are essentially have a set of values that's very future-oriented, you could say. The number two thing is there's a coalition that has built in California that's essentially the nascent coalition that's essentially is going to play out in the United States in the next 20, 30 years, in which you have large numbers of Latinos, which is over a third of the state now, which are getting very politically powerful, that nationally is on a trajectory to essentially be what's the norm in the United States in the next 20, 30 years. Also, California is the youngest state in the union. It's a magnet for young people, and young people overwhelmingly essentially also are backing the Democrats. So you've got this juggernaut of a large group of Latinos which will not vote Republican. You've got a large group of young people who are completely turned off by that conservative politics of the Republicans. And you've got these very liberal bastions of Northern California, San Francisco, and actually LA. So you've actually got a coalition that it's not an aberration that the Democrats are now in power right now, but in fact they're probably in a situation that they'll basically dominate for about 10 or potentially more, 10 to 20 years. What this sets up is a situation where you actually have a moment here where actually California could really reinvent itself politically and reinvent a kind of a new politics, I would say, for this century, around essentially a vision that is very Californian here, but also has a lot of resonance in Europe too, which is essentially a clean tech kind of base of shifting dramatically to clean technologies, a sustainable kind of economy. There's a lot of the early thinking in organic farming and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of biotech out here. There's a lot of kind of cell phone kind of work out here. There's a lot of kind of technology of the future, and it's a very, very globalized, very, very globalized population. I mean, LA is just a polyglot of cultures from all over the world. So what you've got is a global, future-oriented state that is essentially tuning into the issues of the future, and not the least of which is essentially climate change and the environmental kind of repercussions of that, which has been in the blood of kind of Californians for many decades, but is coming to a head right now. So what I'm kind of trying to say from a kind of, as someone, as a project, if you're starting to think about what's coming up in the future, what's the larger scenario kind of issues that are essentially going to shape the future of money and the future of transactions, one really key insight into what's happening is look really hard at California. Look at California, because there's actually this moment in the next 2 to 5 years here, I think, that you're going to see an incredible amount of innovation happening in this state. The state has kind of hit bottom, kind of financially, because it's in the death throes of that old system. It's still caught in that polarized kind of politics of the kind of past that the whole country's been caught in for 30 years. But it's at a moment of inflection that I think there's a real reinvention happening here that's going to be really worth watching for the next 2 years. And I think that you'll see how what does get invented here in the short term, in the next couple of years, will be used as a kind of a Me Too point to California for Obama and actually national Democrats that I think will help to shape the national discussion here in the United States in the next, by the 2012 elections too. So there's a really interesting inflection with the politics. I can continue on every one of those other little spaces that with the politics change, I think you're going to see some big economic changes about how we actually treat reorganizing the economy around essentially a more clean tech energy systems and actually sustainable kind of green economy kind of economic practices. I think you're going to see a real new investment in a lot of new kinds of technologies that are essentially are being born here as well. And I think ultimately you'll see a lot of cultural implications of that too. So there's a kind of a moment here where it's really worth tuning back into California, even though you could say At different times in the last 30 years, you might have had less reason to do that. This is a time I would really tune in. One of the things, partly because of this kind of reputation California's had over the years, it's become a magnet for basic innovators, about entrepreneurs from all over the world. It's just, quite astounding, frankly. And so what you've kind of done is, particularly in Northern California now, even more so than Southern, is you've just got this incredible piling up of incredibly talented people, entrepreneurial folks, can-do people, future-oriented people, energized people, kind of extremely talented people. And it's kind of crossed the point where it's essentially, it's like exploded. And so it's quite extraordinary when you think about it, that how could it be that in a globally competitive world in which you've got open, transparent channels of communication and media that saturates us in every corner of the planet, that within literally about a 10-mile radius, you've got the three absolutely most powerful, dominant technology companies of this moment. You've got Apple Computer, you've got Google, and you've got Facebook, and literally you could basically, a little zip car and get to every one of them within 5 minutes, right? Something's going on there. If you go one notch down into the next tier, you'd say, of the most, interesting technology companies, you've got Twitter up here in San Francisco. You've got YouTube just south of San Francisco in San Bruno. You've got actually Skype relocated, into eBay, eBay itself, and then Skype's kind of such an interesting company now, but again, pulled in from Europe. You've just got this next tier there, and then it just keeps going down and down and down. So you've got this supernova kind of thing of cauldron of innovation happening here. Now, there's a couple of interesting reflections of that. It's like, what is it about physicality that even in this kind of digital age and this transparent age of kind of multiple video links from all over the world, that people feel this kind of need to actually be banging elbows physically in the same space, and that's kind of its own little reflection. But I think for what you're kind of saying is what's happening is you're getting essentially a supercharged environment of can-do entrepreneurial spirit that is just feeding on itself. And it's basically what you want to happen when you're at one of these kind of inflection points of a kind of reinvention of a new system. And I would say this reinvention of money or transactions, which is kind of your exploring, is essentially nestled into a larger kind of explosion of innovation and reworking of a global system that's essentially happening now. And I think here, from that point of view, you've essentially got in one place within, let's say, a 30-mile square radius, or not square, but circular radius here, you've got a lot of the pieces, I think, that'll create that technological underpinning for that next system. And so I think it's great that you're here. I think it's a really important piece of what you're exploring here. So one of the general things is you don't have to worry about the past. You don't be concerned about legacy systems. I know that's one of the issues you're kind of wrestling with. What's going to get invented here is not going to be that worried about what happened before. It's going to be worried about what's possible going forward. So that's an interesting little thing. So, and it's something that you should say, that's an, I think it has some implications for the way you guys have got to think about it, because there could be some very different kind of way to think about this that might get born. And that was in the kind of, the bones are in the kind of lifeblood of everybody who kind of piles up here. So there's a kind of future orientation. There tends to be, just a complete and utter kind of network mentality here. That, a flattening of relationships rather than any kind of hierarchical relationships. So if you think architecturally about what you guys are thinking about, and I don't know exactly how it plays out in your space, so I'm just saying, generically speaking, is they'll always look for a solution that's more flattened and kind of interconnected at a kind of network level than essentially anything that actually has to work up through any kind of hierarchies, for example. it's extremely youthful. I mean, one way to just substitute for what's the mentality here is just think youthful. What is, even if it's somebody's 50 or 60, they're actually thinking like young. They're thinking exuberant. They're thinking high energy. They're thinking, they get excited about something. So there's a kind of a youthfulness. And so how would young people look at X, Y, Z, anything you want to say? So what would they think about a banking system of transactions? You know, what do they care about big banks? Do they care about, you know, anyhow, do they care about how it was done 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Or do they care about what their parents did? Anyhow, just apply that kind of attitude towards anything. It's an incredibly global community. And everyone's kind of heard the stats on, you know, kind of how many, you know, Indian entrepreneurs and Chinese entrepreneurs and Russian entrepreneurs, and, you know, they all pile up here. And because of that, there's a real sense of boundarylessness in terms of nationalities and borders, and actually concern about those kind of issues. Now, from a technical sense, you know, if it's your business, you've got to deal with it. What is. But their aspirations or their values or their vision of where things are going are borderless and global. You know, by definition, everything is, that's where they're looking. They're not looking at how to solve things in a more kind of circumscribed national way. So if that's what you kind of mean, it's also a very can-do kind of attitude, which kind of means that there is very little concern about what are seen as temporary roadblocks or dead ends. It's just this kind of constant attitude that, well, if I can't do it that way, I can do it another way, or there's a way around it. I mean, there's just a constant like, so that's an interesting piece too, because if you think in your scenarios or however you play it out in your exploration here that, oh, that seems to be a dead end, it's not going to work. There is definitely the mentality here is, well, that doesn't stop us from trying. We're going to go right over the top or around it in a way that no one. So I think there's a kind of a sense of kind of limitlessness or kind of can-do thing, like it's always dead. So if you start to take those attitudes, and you know, we could kind of rough out, kind of brainstorm on other attitudes of that. But basically, what happens is if you kind of take those generic qualities of a lot of talented people in a space like this, it kind of, by definition, expands your horizon of what could be possible and what you should be looking for, frankly, in the terms of this project. Traditionally, what's happened with technology companies is that they're very naive, frankly, about political constraints, government in general, coalition building, and all the kind of stuff that essentially is better left to, in our country, Washington or Brussels or wherever you guys are talking about. And it's just been almost sometimes comical, actually, how little tuned in a lot of these technology companies with. And again, I was at Wired Magazine in the very beginning of the 90s, and it was just something to watch about how the early internet companies and, you know, the early web companies, and then it was the early video companies, and then it's been the early social networking companies. I mean, a lot of these companies are just, over time, they run into the same roadblock, which is they see their technological innovations as just self-evidently, obviously better, and then they kind of don't think about what's the constraints are, and so they run head-on into it. And so, you know, whether it's a Microsoft isn't a barrier, but it's kind of, they were one of the great examples of West Coast kind of, you know, inability to tune into Washington and then get slammed with, you know, kind of legal constraints that kind of basically destroyed their business model, or at least radically constrained their operations. But now it's, you know, Google's the same thing, and Facebook's running into it, and they're all kind of, it's this repeat. So you're absolutely right in terms of the problems of these constraints. But I think what's interesting now, and I could be wrong about this one, but I do think California, you know, the technological innovation thing is a kind of a year in, a year out thing that happens over and over again. Every 5 years there's a new wave. I mean, now it's social networking. It's going to be, you know, but 10 years ago it was, you know, web search engines. I mean, you know, there's this constant reinvention of new technologies. But in a slower kind of wave, you watch political reinventions happen. And I actually think Just like I said, it was a little over 30, it was a little 40, over 30, you could say, maybe 40 years ago when California went through a big reinvention of politics in this state, which eventually went national. I think we're in the beginnings of a political reinvention here, which has a lot of implications of, how to rethink regulation, how to rethink, public investments in new technologies, how to really rethink a way that, shaping the public sector, the public interest, how that actually works in this new era. So I think as much as you're saying, less about how it's worked in the past. How it's worked in the past is they've been stupid about this. They've run into it. They've got their butts kicked, frankly, on some of these issues of importance to technology companies when they run up against the political powers that be. But I think what we're starting to see here is that similar, I think, innovative spirit, a similar kind of entrepreneurial spirit that I think is going to be brought into, frankly, I think it's going to be actually California government. I mean, one just little anecdotal thing is we've just elected a new governor here, Jerry Brown, and people can look back and think, oh my God, he was a governor in the 70s. The thing about Jerry Brown, which a lot of people don't know, and I actually know him quite well, is that he was an absolute visionary governor in the 70s. And one of the things he did is he brought in an incredible brain trust of people into his inner cabinet advisory crew, including people that are some of the most original American thinkers of the time. At that time, it was Stuart Brand, who, and to this day, is kind of a close advisor of his. I mean, people who are really big think, long wave, out of the box thinkers were close advisors of him, and again are in that situation. And so I'm actually involved right now in a project which he's pulling together a task force on how do we really kind of rethink the economy of California to really essentially regenerate a next wave of economic innovation in this country, in this state, to actually essentially draw down, you could say, the unemployment rate or build up the jobs base. But it's really about how do you reshape the priorities of California and get the economy really humming again. And what's interesting about that is, a lot of people might talk about that, but what he's actually doing is pulling together an incredible crew across almost like a who's who of really innovative thinkers in this state, which again is a state that has a lot of these innovative thinkers. And he's actually really open to this. He's really listening to this. So what I would say is watch closely on how regulations might be handled differently here, setting high standards. I mean, there's some general things about California politics as opposed to the United States politics that has been very, very useful. One of the things that they've done is they've learned very much like don't tell companies what to do, but set very high standards, not just encourage them to do things, but like say you have to hit 20% of your energy usage has got to be from clean energy. They did this in a kind of landmark legislation a while back. And lo and behold, here we are 4 years after they did that, and now all the public utilities have now kind of caught up to this thing, and they're actually hitting these deadlines. And so you've spurred an incredible kind of, at least in this country, surge of investment in green technologies and a whole kind of scaling up of a workforce here now that knows stuff about clean energy. So they're all about setting high standards, ambitious standards that look crazy at the time that people kind of balk at and say there's no way we can hit it. But they consistently do that. That's one thing that's essentially a new way of regulating, essentially, is standardize, high standards, and then let people figure out how to get there. Anyhow, there's a series of these kind of tricks that they've actually learned over time. And I think there'll be a lot more kind of new methods that develop in the next couple of years. And I think we're going to see some new ways to marry the needs of this new technological innovation with the societal needs of steering it or directing it or actually generating public investment. Well, one of the things, I think there's two pieces to think about the speed of political and ultimately through politics, social change. On the one hand, there is a general metric that is about how quickly do human beings change that essentially has, you could argue, some consistency from era to era regardless of the technology. So there's a kind of a level of that to really change people's minds and get new systems going and train people differently, and it takes time. So there's a kind of a longer wave that you have to think about sometimes how political change happens. That's one way you could argue or you could say, oh, you got to keep that in mind. But what's interesting about, and I think that's the norm actually of how things get done in general politics and general times, you know, consistently in history in this country, and I'm assuming in Europe as well. The exception to this is that there's essentially periodic moments in history, not just in California, but nationally in our case and European context. I'm sure you have your examples as well, that you get essentially really explosive change. There's a kind of essentially junctures between eras where you watch massive system breakdown and then you see really quite radical system building. And I think one of the things, big ideas to be kind of keeping in mind here is I would argue we're kind of in one of those moments now. And if you want to think about it as the 2008 global financial crash, or if you want to, you know, there's a bunch of metrics to kind of say we're watching essentially if not full collapse, the serious system failure of many of what essentially were the late 20th century systems. And in your world, the financial world, we watched the granddaddy of them all in the 2008 financial crisis, which, you know, next to the Great Depression crash, you know, was really the worst thing we've actually seen in a long time. And I think it was essentially the great symptom of essentially a large system collapse essentially that's at its core. Now we've resuscitated it, and there's a lot of people thinking, you know, do we miss the moment? But I think in the larger context of kind of looking at history, I think that's going to be looked at as essentially the last great kind of episode of essentially the 20th century way of doing money, if that's maybe the way you want to think about it. Now what's happening is we're watching, it's always hard the beginning of the next thing because it's not all finely tuned, ready to go to kind of sink right into kind of, it's our turn, boom, check into it. In fact, it works the opposite. You see the old system crash, people don't know anything else, so they kind of try to like get it going again, and then they try to cobble it together. But in the minds of most people, that old system is completely discredited. I mean, the idea, and the idea that, yeah, Wall Street's getting its profit margins back and it's got it back on its feet, you know, it's a temporary kind of, it's a mirage essentially of the return of that old system. And so what I think's happening is you're watching essentially a holding pattern or something. And what you'll probably see in the next, you know, 2 to 5 years is you're going to see a lot of new things tried, and at some point you're going to see something that will essentially really catch, and it will really be the way to go. This is very, historically, this is kind of the way it's often worked, essentially. So for example, if you look back in the 30s, you know, there was the system crash of 29, and then there was essentially 4 years, 5 years of just everybody spinning their wheels, and the economy couldn't get going, and they kind of tried to stabilize it. And, you know, Europe had its problems, the U.S. had its problems, and, you know, eventually it ended up in a war, and we ended up kind of building ourselves out of it through the war, but it really wasn't the next system that would supersede that old, broken, screwed-up system that crashed in 29. It really didn't get built out until the post-war world, but when it got rebuilt, it was essentially built in the space of just a few years. I mean, you watched, coming out of World War II, you basically watched the Bretton Woods kind of currency accords. You had basically created the IMF. You watched them create the World Bank. You basically, all these institutions, the United Nations itself. I mean, all these things that essentially ensured the kind of international financial structure, which is we're still basically living in, those same, you know, that same framework. It all happened within about 3 years. In fact, it depends on how you time it. You could even be within, you know, a year and a half, in fact, of how it all got invented. But so you see very quickly things happen. Now, granted, that was a world war and that was a lot of destruction, and, you know, you could say, well, God, maybe that is a different case. But I think it's actually insightful into basically the way system change works. And so I think without taking too big a stretch, you could kind of say we're in that kind of post-crash period that was like the early 30s. You know, I mean, FDR himself, he didn't jump in. He campaigned in the 32 election on essentially deficit reduction. I mean, kind of, he was an austerity guy. He was doing what everybody in Europe's doing and what basically the Republicans are doing in this country. And in fact, it was only when he got radicalized when in power that actually he shifted that, and by 36 was essentially realizing, hey, that's the wrong way to go, and kind of had shifted to a much more Keynesian, well, a Keynesian model, which was only itself invented in the early 30s by Keynes himself. I mean, so we're kind of in that experimental, everyone's trying shit out, we're just getting our bearings a little bit on, oh my God, this is bigger than we thought. And I think, but to come out of this in like 10 years, we're going to look back on this and say, oh, I see what happened. Just like I think you could see that, I mean, the World War got in the way there, but I think it was by 1948 you could look back and say, oh, I see what happened. We collapsed, we did it, we shifted to Keynesianism, welfare states, New Deal economics, and we rebuilt a post-war world. And, you know, oh, we have these institutions that are going to do it, IMF, World Bank, United Nations, and they're going to figure it out. And we sat then from that time on, the late 40s, till now. It's those same institutions. There's been very little innovation in that space to this moment. I think that's going to change. And I think it's not that just, oh, we had this financial crash. We had this financial crash because the world has changed so fundamentally in the late 20th century, early 21st. The highly globalized, highly interconnected global economy, I mean, all these other things we know about, these things have essentially just burst that old system into seeds. It kind of just made it, and that thing went through so much, kind of squeezed the juice out of the old system that it's just unable to kind of map onto the world as we know it going forward. And that's the juncture we're in. And so I think that is where many systems will get invented, and one of the ones that's going to get invented really at the core of everything is money, financial transactions, capital flows, how that gets regulated in old terms, but essentially it's more generically, how do people take some control over their destiny by influencing how capital gets productively channeled and gets productively, or gets kind of systematically kind of contained, so it doesn't have the kind of damages that actually can go along with the more kind of out of control way it's been going, or the more kind of system crashes, things that we barely made it through in 2008. So anyhow, it's a really interesting time for your space, frankly, right now. One of the things, I think first of all, let me be clear, it's not everything gets invented in California, but I think every region has something to add to the puzzle. But I would say what you're probably going to see in California, or this Northern Cal, in its piece to the larger puzzle, will essentially be, in terms of this transaction lens that you guys are putting into it, is I think you should be looking at how transactions will be increasingly between things rather than people, really is one way to think about it. And I think what we're starting to see is essentially intelligence is getting built into things that can actually do things without people telling it what to do. So you could imagine, micropayments actually going on between machines, or between the doorknob and the room and your phone that's just on a human person's body or something. I mean, anyhow, there's a kind of thing of embedded intelligence and networked intelligence that essentially you should be thinking that something's going on there. In fact, I was reading Kevin Kelly's new book called What Technology Wants. I'm just about finishing it, which is a terrific book and something to really tune into there. But some of the statistics that he's talking about were fantastic. I mean, for example, now, I mean, just as an example, like there's now 1 trillion web pages. It was the first time I've actually heard that name, that number right there. And he starts to talk about how many chips there are actually in the world, even with kind of the most simple chips that essentially have the amount of neurons that a kind of a little ant would have or something. And he starts talking about how all these things are starting to get interconnected and doing some pretty kind of amazing things of how they talk to each other and how they start to connect to each other. And if you look at that vision 5 or 10 years out, you could imagine where every physical thing we have, including the coffee cup, has embedded kind of little chips in it. And essentially those chips are doing all the transactions, so we don't really have to think about it. So every time you fill your cup, the liquid goes past a little part, and it can figure out that that's coffee. You're charged, whatever, 35 cents for the refill or something. And you don't even have to think about, hey, I got to go to a human being, and I got to ask for it, I got to pay for it with a card, and I got all this stuff. It's like the things have just done it. It's kind of like now cars, and I haven't paid a toll for, I can't even tell you how long, because my car just zings through and it goes on and I trust it, and it's like, think of that for everything. And that thing is, that's a kind of a valley vision. It's kind of that will essentially be where you look for how does that work, what are the standards, what are the protocols, what's the checks of that, how do you secure against that, how do you make sure it isn't abused, how do you actually flag people, how do they interact with it, what's the interface of that. I mean, all kinds of bazillion issues around that. But they're all solvable issues, all bazillion of them. And they will get solved, and not only solved once, they'll be solved 5 times, and it'll be a competition of which of the 5 ways to do it, and the best one will come out, and there'll be a second backup in case that screws up, and that'll be solved forever. That'll be the next Visa. Will be maybe not Visa, it'll be, coffeecupfiller.com or whatever, some kind of figure out how the things talk to each other. Or maybe it is Visa, and maybe it's an innovative way to think about it, or maybe it's your company that you guys are talking about. So anyhow, there's a things-oriented solving the thing that way. One of the things I'm really interested about with China, for example, and I've been actually, in fact, I got a big interview tomorrow with someone on this space who's a China expert myself, is I think what's interesting about China will be innovation. I think the Chinese, and this is kind of heretical a little bit more, but I think the Chinese are going to innovate how do you move how do you force massive change in an extremely concentrated period of time and do it in the most orderly fashion possible. And so I think given the world of climate change and given a world of kind of dramatic shifts in the environment, and also I think it's just a lot of dramatic changes we're going to be watching in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, their political system, it must at least be contemplated, might be superior. And when I say political system, their political and economic system, their version of capitalism, driven by their kind of version of politics or their version of governance, might actually be more suited to the challenges that the entire country, the whole world essentially faces, than the kind of liberal democracy, everybody gets a voice, we all got to vote on it, we got to figure out a political coalition, the minority gets a vote, I mean, everybody's gets to hold up the process, and all the things that we value for other reasons and have valued for, frankly, 200 years, but certainly has been the ascendant and dominant system in the last 50, since the war and since the great kind of head-to-head communism versus capitalism kind of debate kind of played out in the last 30 years, they might get the last laugh. And that essentially we might be totally paralyzed or increasingly paralyzed in the West and in these liberal democracy countries to deal with essentially the mounting issues of this next century. And in fact, their kind of system, political and economic, might be the one that's actually much more innovative or much more useful because it can move fast, broker, kind of get things done. And the world of the future might be that kind of world. It might be more valuable than, in fact, making sure everybody's bought in or making sure even everybody's been heard, or all the issues, all the values that we actually value in the West. So anyhow, that's a different thing. But I would say there could be some large-scale changes might be driven by China. And so, for example, I don't know, in your space, I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but the future of money might get figured out by the future of massive capital shifts that are essentially going to be essentially driven by China. And that will essentially create the next industries of the century here, because they're just going to say, we're going to do it. And when they do it, it'll essentially lock in these kind of standards or lock in these kind of ways of doing things, and might shape how capital gets directed in massive ways in the next 10 years. And they have large amounts of capital, so what they choose to do is not inconsequential, and you can imagine it actually structuring how transactions happen even in the long term. If, a billion, 3.3 Chinese are all doing transactions this way in the 21st century, and Asia, which they have a real kind of dominance over, is, by extension, 2.5 billion more, we might be scrambling after them to figure out, okay, we're in that system now. It's kind of ludicrous. I mean, at some level, you start thinking, oh my God, if 10 years ago that would have seemed like bizarre to even think about that. But it is the way scenaric thinking should be done, and I think it's not implausible that actually would be the way the world is operating in 25 years. Would be much more a Chinese way of doing things, and with environmental system crashes happening around us, and the ice flows cracking off, accelerating, and all the things that, in fact, the West seems absolutely paralyzed to actually really deal effectively with right now. So that's an interesting thing to do it. I think in Europe, for example, I think, and again, I'm just kind of, from my point of view, giving my 2 cents on this, is, to me, I would say what the great innovations of Europe is essentially, I always think of Europe as essentially the first pass at globalization in a kind of a more rubber hits the road way. So essentially, if you think of the expanded European Union as, how do previously autonomous nation states, integrate their governing systems and ultimately their economies in a much more highly calibrated, closely integrated way. And that's the great experiment you guys have been doing for, positive and negative things have come out of that. And this latest version is, people are wondering, well, maybe that experiment, there's people saying, well, Jesus, maybe we having everybody on the same kind of economy actually has its issues, because you got the little guys like Ireland, Portugal, threatening the big guys like Germany and France and all that. I mean, you guys kind of know, you're living that, but from an outsider's perspective, it's like, wow, Europe knows so much more about cross-national integration of both economics and governance than the U.S. will ever know. I mean, we're just completely naive in that. We have no clue. We're still kind of thinking it's the American century, and we can tell people what to do. You've been living the life over there of what it really takes to get collective action done in a messier but kind of cross-border way. So anyhow, I think every region has got its piece of the puzzle of the future, and so I think it's an interesting way as you go exploring, across the planet for different insights. It'd be interesting to plumb deeper in each of those from my point of view. I think it would be absolutely the place to look is, as well as the North, it'd certainly be in the South, and for a bunch of reasons. I mean, I think a lot of these new technologies that are going to be basically developed are going to be easily exported to the South, and I think a lot of them are going to go on the backs of, cell phone repeaters and cell phone kind of computers that essentially are going to be distributed in everybody's hands. So,
will they be exported, or will they be invented in the South?
I personally do not think you're going to see a lot of invention. Well, this is, this could be controversial, but I would say my feeling is that essentially, if you think of, I tend to think that we really should be thinking about the world as one integrated global unit, and that just like not everybody does everything, that you actually have these specialized centers essentially. And I think to me, it's idealistic, but I think off the mark to think that some entrepreneur in Uganda or something or wherever is going to figure this out. I think there is a lot to be said that you're watching essentially technological innovation is going to be aggregating around here, and so I would look much more, I think it's much more promising to see whether the next technological solutions will come out of the nodes in the global system that essentially are aggregating a lot of the technologically innovative-minded folks. So that's just my feeling. Now, I do think in terms of the distribution side of it, though, I think the great markets that will essentially suck these things in, I think are going to be often in these kind of very nascent markets that essentially have so much room to run in terms of catching up to the systems of the developed world. And so I do feel you're going to watch the South in general, or the undeveloped world, or however you want to frame it, as test beds, you could say, for a lot of this gets figured out. And there'll be a lot of kind of incremental innovation around these technologies in these environments that are unique to that space, and that'll kind of be broadly shared across the South or across the world, and you'll see it pick up in other areas. So I'm not saying it's devoid of innovation, but I think the real systemic or the real kind of particularly technological innovation, I don't think would be looking there in my own feeling. India is its own little animal. That's not what I think of when I think of the, I'm thinking about more the really underdeveloped South, not India, China kind of piece. The other thing about it, which it brings up, is the South is young. And I know this is a topic you also we're going to talk a little bit about, but essentially there is this phenomena that basically new systems are essentially usually invented by the young. That older people, even people my age, which I don't think of myself as particularly young, but we tend to essentially, individually, and myself as one of them, I think of myself as quite innovative and open-minded, but in general, people my age and older, you tend to be very much rooted in legacy systems, and you are very much rooted, your career is really essentially spent highly invested in the old way of operating. And so it's very, very rare that you see people of older ages breaking through with really new thinking, real fresh, new systemic thinking. Minor innovations a little bit, but you don't see breakthrough thinking in that way. And that's why you see, real genius coming through at the young. And that's why you see, like, the guy who founds Facebook is, 26 to this day, And that's less, an aberration and more a kind of a phenom that's very common to new thinking. With that in mind, you're watching huge numbers of young people, essentially, in a lot of these countries in the South. And so you're watching a lot of people that are extremely predisposed to the new and are extremely predisposed to trying something different than what happened before. And so that's essentially a context that is ripe for, explosive change, basically. It also covers its way, this what I would call, and other people call this millennial generation, is also a phenomenon across the developed world too, and including the United States here. It's essentially anyone in their 20s and teens right now, I would roughly call millennials. And technically in the United States, the way I look at it is about age 31 now to about age, I think it's 13. People quibble about the ends, front and the bottom, but roughly that's what it is. And so that is essentially the biggest generation in American history right now. It's bigger than the baby boom. And it is hitting its critical moment in kind of shaping the society, because they are now essentially moving into the economy en masse. They're buying their homes, they're starting their families, they're adapting their brands, they're doing all the things that essentially start to really make their much larger impact in the economy. And this is, where in the world of transactions or banking or finance is very critical for you guys to be thinking, is like, this is a nascent generation that once they lock on these things and once they essentially invent the way they want to do things, it's gonna have a huge impact, because it's a massive generation in the West, certainly in this country. I'm not sure exactly how the demographics play in Europe, but I would say it's roughly probably equivalent. They're essentially the kids of the baby boom, and in this country they're the kids of the immigrants, and there's been these huge waves of immigrants. So you don't have that as much in Europe, but essentially you have this phenomenon now of a generation that's going to really define how things get done for a while here. Their technology habits, their media habits, their mobile habits, they're also very group oriented. The social networking is not just they tend to want to be social networking. It's essentially completely a reflection of how they actually interact. They always work in packs. They don't. They love teams. They're very kind of flattened, kind of how they actually. They're not hierarchical. They're not individualistic as a generation, unlike boomers, which are all about themselves, egos. Anyhow, there's a lot of characteristics of this generation that you could see playing out in how the technology works. And how the trends work. The other thing to think about is they are about their core values. And one of their core values, which is absolutely across the entire planet as it showed up in this generation, is they're much more tuned in to the environment in general, but essentially this issue of climate change than the older generations. And I think this is another thing that I think, as we're kind of in this kind of I know I'm roughing out kind of a lot of different areas that you guys will be exploring, but I do think this climate change issue is more than any other issue is going to basically define the next 50 years. And I think this has, and this generation, it is their core issue. It is their issue that, as in almost lockstep, they take this for granted and they see their world as essentially going to be defined by this. So one of the reasons I think this is something to really think about is, if I were to say the future of transactions, one of the huge new transaction spaces I would say that are going to happen is essentially the transactions of impact on climate, environment, or global warming, essentially. I think everything, even if it's not a monetary transaction, there is going to be essentially in the future, single thing we do is essentially going to be a transaction is going to go on of how much impact that made on the environment. It might not happen in 5 years or even 10 years, but in the 21st century, that will be calculated in everything we do. And I think there's a transaction, it's the way to think of it is a transaction. Now, whether that transaction will be calculated by the people who do monetary transactions, it's probable. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be done by those people. But it is a transaction nonetheless. So if I were your kind of group, I would be thinking broadly of what is a transaction, and the transaction there is going to be essentially a metric of how much impact we make on the environment, because that is going to be, without question in my mind, that is going to be the defining issue that we're going to all be struggling with through the entire century. It won't even be solved by the end of the century. And so that piece of information, I mean, for example, it could even be to the point I mentioned how if you have chips in everything we do, I mean, if you open that door and heat from that room seeps out that you have to regenerate with more energy, that transaction might be recorded. And, you know, you'll learn to only open the door as little as you can because you want to preserve that little micro payment. I mean, it's that level of thinking you got to be thinking about. We're going to have essentially that's the world I think we're going to go into more than we can really think about. Now, there's other scenarios of how that could play. We could find a dirt cheap way to kind of energy that has no environmental impact, and then we don't care if the door's open all the time or we heat the whole planet or, you know, cool the whole planet. But I would say that's much less likely than essentially a future where we will be extremely attuned to our impact on the planet, and that because of that, everything will have to be calculated. And essentially, that's all about transactions. It happens that I've been involved for the last year in a really fascinating project, actually, which has been funded by George Soros, the billionaire financier and essentially the founder of the Open Society, who really was really visionary and instrumental in opening up Eastern Europe in the kind of out of communism and into kind of the free market and economy and democracies in the 80s and 90s. Soros has always kind of thought of himself as a kind of an economic theorist as well as a practical economic guy trading global currencies. And he has seen some critical kind of issues brewing in the old paradigm of economic thinking that's really been dominant in the last 30 years, both in the United States and in Europe particularly, and what he would call free market fundamentalism, which essentially, you know, was the economic theory with kind of characterized in the West by, you know, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and kind of played its way out all through the continent as well. So what's happened is in the wake of this 2008 crash, he and people around him have seen a huge opening to essentially enable the next generation of economists globally to fundamentally rethink economics for the 21st century. And so he has put initially $100 million into this, but he's worth $26 billion, and it is one of his big legacy plays, the way he talks about it now as an 80-year-old. And he is drawing other people to put comparable sums into this relatively nascent effort. It's been up for a year now, called the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And my company, Next Agenda, has been kind of joined at the hip with them for this first year, essentially running all their web presence, doing all the kind of video around their gatherings, and also driving web content and collaboration online with this generation. And so I'm kind of been pretty closely watching this, and it's been a really exciting thing to watch. And also, I think it's something that has some implications for your project and thinking about the future of future money, future transactions. So their kind of worldview, or his worldview, but this INET, as you call it, the Institute for New Economic Thinking's worldview, is that we have watched with that collapse in 2008, essentially this collapse of the old economic paradigm, which, when I say that, it means the core theories that are that describe the economy and understood how the economy worked have kind of past the point of their usefulness. They're way too limited. They're way too flawed to actually map onto reality, which is partly what happened with that 2008 crash. Not the set of policies that are built on those theories are way outmoded, which is we're still trying to squeeze the juice out of things that essentially might have been innovative 30 years ago, but are way inadequate to the task of a world of hyper-globalization and climate change, and among other issues. So those policies are totally outmoded, and essentially the practices, the way business operates, practical business outside of policy and outside of beyond theory, how do you just run economic things in this world are completely outmoded. And so they see that while the system is doing its best to hang on, we're watching that, the death throes of that. So a little bit of their institute is to kind of point out how grossly inadequate across all these fronts this old system, this old paradigm is. But really the energy that they're trying to invest is how do you invest in literally an entire generation of economists, not just the United States and the West, but literally globally. They have big aspirations for China and India and the developing world, the South, to literally fund in a very comprehensive way as many of the leading economists as they can, to break them free of the old structures of academia and the support of the old granting systems and the 10-year committees and the journals and everything that have kind of been the keepers of this flame of this old free market fundamentalism. They're trying to break them away of that and allow them the kind of space to really think openly, freely, and really, really innovatively about what is a much, much better way to approach this in the 21st century. And they see this as a decades-long run. They see themselves as a 10, 20, 30-year effort here, but their goal is audacious. They really think that they can help accelerate as dramatically as possible essentially a new conception of how the theory of how an economy actually works, understand it much deeper and much more accurately to what's really happening, to build policies that are much more effective for nations and actually increasingly global kind of institutions, and even some thinking on what those institutions should be like, and ultimately how business itself would run in the 21st century. And a big piece of that would be, of course, thinking through how the economy of the 21st century has to fundamentally get reshaped in the light of climate change and in the light of making that economically viable, that shift to the clean energies and the sustainable economy that's got to eventually come around. So anyhow, it seems crazy ambitious, very audacious kind of goals, but it is something that's concretized, institutionalized, has serious money behind it by Soros himself, and increasingly other folks starting to really come to that, and I think it's something to really watch. And the reason I think it's really important for your project here is it's one thing to kind of just think, oh, something will happen, and eventually there is a new paradigm that'll get figured out, and new financing and new methods of transaction will come out of that. But it's another thing to be aware of, that in fact there's like millions and potentially billions of dollars that is going to move into this space very quickly to kind of really accelerate this kind of innovation in a way that's not just hand waving and, oh God, we need someone to do this, but like they're doing it. And so I do think that we talked about how the young are essentially the harbingers of or the creators of the future, they're the ones that are most predisposed to invent the new thing. And we talked about it in other contexts in the tech world here, in Silicon Valley. We talk about it in the large numbers of young people in Global South. But I think this is very much in tune with that same kind of way of thinking, that essentially now you're watching an entire generation, potentially, of economists from all around the world that'll essentially be focused on a pretty fundamental task, but one that is solvable and is doable, and ultimately I think is going to have, or could certainly have, big implications for all of us. This new entity, basically what's called INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, is just beginning, and so they've got a series of task force going, and they're starting to really move money into their first round of grants, and they're starting to set up you could say, affiliated partner institutes with all these leading universities around the world. So they're kind of building the infrastructure of this thing and actually figuring out kind of the long-term, more concrete goals of what they're doing. But one of the things that is absolutely central to what they're doing is essentially a real reinvention of finance and macroeconomic theory. I mean, they're taking as their starting point the crash of 2008, which everybody is collecting around this flag, starting with Soros and all the people. And the people are like Nobel laureates and stuff, like Joe Stiglitz is one of them, and George Akerlof. And I mean, guys like Paul Volcker is now putting his own money into it. And these are like serious folks that are coming into this too. So it's not just Soros. But one of the things that absolutely is a common kind of perception of what's happened is that the 2008 crash was not an aberration. It was not a mistake, but it was essentially a fundamental moment in economic history that essentially was comparable to what happened in the 29 crash, and is essentially the sign of essentially of a need for a real fundamental reinvention in the same spirit. And they actually harken back to the same spirit of reinvention that happened with John Maynard Keynes, and essentially the invention, you could say, of a Keynesian economic theories to build kind of Keynesian economic policies that essentially built a new way of actually operating capitalism in the West that came out of World War II, and they see themselves as similarly positioned right now. In fact, they kicked off their first inaugural conference was at King's College, Keynes's College in the University of Cambridge in England, with a direct, the reason they did that was to say we're in a very parallel moment, and we're at the beginning of a very parallel project, and in this case, it's our era's version of essentially a fundamental rethink. And so first and foremost of that rethink is essentially to rethink finance, which is so screwed up right now, they would say, and so problematic that essentially we really gotta go back to some really fundamental ways of rethinking this. Now, they're not prescribing this is exactly what should happen or what do we think. It's not like going back to old Keynesian theory or anything like that. So I want to be clear. It's like they don't know exactly what's coming out of this, but they feel like they're at this juncture. And so they are funding a variety of independent thinkers and a variety of people in task forces to actually really do sustained work in this space to essentially, so that as soon as possible they can accelerate an emergence of essentially a new model of understanding global finance that's much more mapped onto how things really work and what things can really do. And then also, they're also trying to realign the economics field back to essentially its core mission, which is to actually serve society and be used as a tool for the general well-being of the larger society, both in individual countries but also around the world. And so they clearly see, in that respect, it's also more in line with the values and the legacy of the kind of essentially the Keynesian revolution that happened in the 30s, which was the innovation that came out of that period was towards making an economy that worked for more people, was more broadly distributed wealth, that had more kind of prosperity spreading to more corners of
the social kind of sphere that was not just, piling up kind of into one, the advantage of one country, but essentially was something that could be adopted broadly around all kinds of countries. I mean, there was a lot of kind of nascent values in the innovation that happened there that they kind of want to harken back to. This isn't about reinventing finance so that you could get more billionaires or that you could figure out a way so that, Wall Street could actually get higher profit margins. They're in fact just the opposite. They're trying to figure out how did we get to that place that the economics field is all focused on how to gin up mathematical models to figure out ways to squeeze more kind of margin out of currency transaction or something. And that we need to basically figure out, get the energy, the economics profession into how do we create an economy that works for a much broader and the broadest possible group of people for the long run, and does it in a way that we actually, make the least amount of impact on the environment and actually create a world that's actually worth, passing on to our kids. So it's a kind of a, aspirational thing, but I think there's a lot of real world, hard-nosed kind of side to this that's worth tuning into. And I think in your field, I can't say in the near term, like, oh my God, in the next 6 months there'll be some breakthrough there that'll totally radicalize, your space. But I would say it's something that if I were you, I would be consistently watching this space and the people that they collect around that space, and being aware of the kind of innovation they're trying to fund early. And the kinds of projects and the kind of thinkers. And also I think the network they're building there of young people and young economists and young, finance types would be somebody just to kind of tune into as people to track, because, these are like the leading lights they're trying to pull out of the best universities in the world, and, they'll be the folks in 10 years, 15 years will get these Nobel Prizes. And so if I were in your space, I'd be watching their career trajectories early and tuned into what they say now, because that's like I say, that's the crew that the big innovations will come from. It won't come from the graying, former Nobel laureate who has nothing really more to motivate him, but yet another applause from another crew that's basically talking about the thing he once did. So anyhow, it's a neat space. I would tune into it and wish you luck on your next on this journey to figure out the future of transactions.